On the Track is a web TV show about cryptozoology, natural history, green issues and whatever else the team feel like making up as they go along. Enjoy!
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you will remember our old friends Tim Whittard and Matt Everett, who, amongst other things, are running the Fortean Film Festival. And they were kind enough to invite members of the On the Track team to submit short films to the festival as entrants. And I'm very pleased to say that we have our first entrant now. It's from Hennis, and it was shot on location in Stratford-upon-Avon. Well, I think that's a particularly fine piece of cinematography, but unfortunately Mr. Louis tells me that young people don't need the avant-garde because they've got QR codes.
I really like the old credits.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of On the Track. I'm very pleased to be back here again. My name's John Downs, and I'm the director of the Centre for Fortean Zoology, but I suspect most of you watching already know that. However, on the off chance that some of you are newbies, if I may use the current vernacular, it's always worth introducing myself again, just in case. Now, I've got something really rather important that I want to share with you. And in fact, I'm hoping that someone out there in viewerland is going to be able to help me. Because back in 2004 or 2005, I'm not sure which, I was a member of one of the herpetological societies, and I got the annual journal that they put out, but because my memory is not what it once was, and for all sorts of other reasons, which I'm going to tell you in a minute, I can't remember which one it was, which was a great pity because I need to find this article, because it was an article about how people could test which species of frog were living in an area by recording their calls and running the calls through a piece of free software. Now, the people who did the original project, which was written up in the journal, I can't remember its name, had some very remarkable results, and I'm going to be coming on to them in a minute. But unfortunately, I had been planning to do something about this and involve the CFZ in this big project because I think it's a really interesting thing to do. But then my father was taken ill in what turned out to be his final illness, and I went to look after him, and I got engaged to Karina, and I moved up to North Devon, and all sorts of stuff got in the way. I lost complete sight of the ball on this particular ball, and I've not been able to pick it back since. So, if any of you can find out, one, what journal or erudite society publication it was, two, when it was, and three, how I can get hold of a copy, I'd be very, very grateful. Now, what is this all about? Okay guys, I want to talk about frogs and toads. And now we're going to do a really, really, really simple rule of thumb here. Forget about toads, forget about tree frogs, and forget about the weird things like spadefoots. There are two main groups of frogs in Western Europe, and they can be briefly called green frogs and brown frogs. The brown frogs in Britain are represented by Rana temporaria, the common frog, and if you look in any of the books on British natural history, which boys like me were given by kind aunts and godparents during our childhood in the 1960s, it said there were two species of green frog in Britain, the edible frog and the marsh frog. Of course this wouldn't happen these days, because these days I suspect the children are given the boy's book of personal pronouns or the young person's guide to Pokemon, which is a great pity because there's a whole generation of frogs having grown up without young people to study them. The two species of green frog are particularly interesting because even back in the 60s in my boy's book of frogs, in fact I can't remember what it was called, but it was something like this, it admitted that neither species were native to these islands and had been brought either by the Romans or by the well-meaning chefs following in the wake of the Norman conquest. Now I've got bad news for anybody who, like me, still treasures their 60-year-old copy of the boy's book of frogs. Pretty well everything that they tell you in there about green frogs is completely wrong. It appears that current thinking is that both the species were introduced into southern England, mostly in the Romney Marsh area, in the times between the late 19th century and about 1935. And both of them have done reasonably well. However, there is one very big if here. In fact, I'm not sure if it's an if or a but I know if I said big but, everybody would start to snigger, wouldn't they, V? This is what happens when you let the lol poops listen while you're actually trying to make a broadcast. But never mind, little things please little minds, and little trousers fit little behinds, as my dear mother used to say. The interesting thing about these species of green frog is that one of them isn't a species after all. It isn't a species at all. The edible frog is a complex introgressive hybrid between the marsh frog and the pool frog, and until very, very recently nobody ever thought there were any pool frogs living in Britain since the last ice age. But sometime in the late 1990s somebody found the final colony of them in Britain, somewhere in East Anglia I believe, and the last one died in captivity, being treated very kindly and given all sorts of lovely delicacies which every frog would want. Now, this is important because as the marsh frog is known to hybridize with the pool frog to produce the edible frog, and as edible frogs are found quite widely in Britain now, the logic dictates that there would have to be pool frogs to hybridize with the marsh frogs in order to produce them. And if there are pool frogs, where are they? And this is where we come back to the wonderful article which I was so transfixed by in the months before my father was taken ill and I left Exeter for good and came back up here. Because this article suggested that it would be worth going to the available green frog habitat in Britain and recording the vocalizations of the green frogs there in order to find out exactly what species they were. And it said that it had managed to, and this is from memory, but I think it had managed to chart 0.02% of the available green frog habitat in Britain, and that the initial results didn't just prove that there were pool frogs where they were not supposed to be, but it looked like there were anything up to half a dozen different types of frog in this area, and that work needed to be done in order to find out what species of frogs actually are native to Britain, because evidence in the last few years discovering the pool frog that I've mentioned just now, and also work which Darren Naish has done, which has suggested that there were green tree frogs living in the New Forest until very recently, and we have come up with supportive evidence for green tree frogs in the South Midlands, because when Carl Marshall was working at the butterfly farm, he was brought a green tree frog that somebody had caught wild, and it does appear that everything that was in the boys' book of frogs from my childhood is quite largely wrong. Now, I wonder if I can take a leaf out of the modern playbook. I wonder if I can find who it was who published the Boys' Book of Frogs, and I can sue them for mental torture, for upsetting me so badly when I found out that the book that my godmother, Auntie Phil, gave me was not entirely correct. This has given me really, really bad trauma. I have been having bad dreams about frogs, and if it hadn't been for your negligence in publishing this book, I would probably be what normal people would like to call normal. But that is something that will always, always be denied me because of the Boys' Book of Frogs. However, being more sensible, I'm very fond of the Boys' Book of Frogs, and I'm going to keep the Boys' Book of Frogs. I would be very interested if somebody could find me the original article that I'm talking about, because it is something that now computers and tablets are so much cheaper and easier to get hold of. This is a project that I want to do with the CFZ, and I have every intention of publishing the results in something called the New Boys Book of Frogs. What do you think of... I'm trying to work out how to put this so it's not a leading question. Recently, it was decided that one of the populations of orangutans in Sumatra is a different species.
Tapanuli.
The Tapanuli orangutan. Yeah. Does this give you any hope or otherwise that the orangutans may have speciated again elsewhere, causing some of the cryptids that have been reported?
Well, I think the orang Pendek is a ground-dwelling, upright walking orangutan. You remember the hair we brought back? Lars Thomas looked at it and he said it's related to but distinct from the Sumatran orangutan.
If it was, it would have to be extremely intelligent, simply because there's tigers in Sumatra on the ground. So that to me makes more sense that they would be, if they are on the ground, they've got to be really much more intelligent than the standard Sumatran orangutan, which obviously has, the Bornean orangutan, which obviously doesn't have any tigers around it apparently. Saying that though, some of the tribes have got tigers' teeth on their necklaces, and it's debatable where they came from.
Yeah, but if you see the footprint of the orang Pendek, it's got a very human-like heel, a broad heel, and 4 toes on it at the front, then an offset big toe, which is significantly less prehensile than...
I get that impression by the tracks. Yeah.
And if you look at the handprint, it's more like the handprint of a small gorilla. It hasn't got the great long fingers of the orangutan and the tiny little thumb. It's got a much bigger thumb that looks much more opposable, which makes sense for a ground-dwelling ape.
But when Sahar and Dave Archer saw what appears to have been an orang Pendek, it was up a tree. The fact that a creature is largely ground-dwelling doesn't mean it's always ground-dwelling.
Oh no, there's lots of reports of orang Pendeks, when they've been sighted, they've gone straight up into trees as a defence mechanism.
Which might then explain the quandary that Carl has about them having problems dodging tigers. When they smell a tiger in the area, they say, right, so this forgive the soldiers and get right up a tree.
Yeah.
Do you think there are any other cryptic orangutans? I'm thinking about the reports of orangutans in the Philippines and from the Malayan.
Well, these could be escapees from captivity, or they could be undiscovered populations. I met a guy on a train once. I was going up to Wales for an episode of an old TV show about mystery animals. It was an Australian show, and there'd been a photograph of a sea serpent in this bay in Wales, and I was going up to film for a weekend talking about that. And on the way up, I just got chatting to this old bloke on the train, and he had these tattoos on the palms of his hands, these sort of oriental lettering. And I said, oh, that's interesting, where'd you get that from? And I said, oh, I was in Malaya, and I was the last generation that did national service, and I did mine in Malaya. And I said, oh, you see much wildlife? And he said, yeah, there was this great big python we saw, and And I said, I saw an orangutan once. And I said, what? I said, yeah, I saw an orangutan. And he says, yeah, it was about as tall as me, but very, very muscular. He said, I didn't see the face, but it had this long ginger hair, and it was like swinging through the trees, and there was this crashing noise. And I was with some locals, and they said it was an orangutan. And of course, orangutans are not meant to live in Malaya. So is this an escaped individual from captivity, or is it a remnant population? Because we now know that some of the mainland orangutans survived a lot longer than we thought. They survived well into the Holocene, the modern period. And there's a lot more of them, a lot different types of orangutan. So it's not impossible.
The Tapanuli orangutan was only first spotted in about 1997, wasn't it?
Yeah.
That's got to be relevant.
Mm.
I mean, I know it took a long time to work out it was its own taxon or whatever, but it was unknown in 1990.
If you want to support us and help us make more content like these, please press like, subscribe, follow our Facebook page and check out our Patreon.
And as the ghost of Joe Strummer, who's an ever more regular visitor to my little studio, wants me to remind you, always press the notification bell. Otherwise you won't be told when there's a new show to watch. And that would be an awful pity, wouldn't it? Well, ladies and gentlemen, here we are at the end of another show. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope that our weekly mix of hard science, weird shit, and a bit of ham-fisted sorry alchemy continues to be entertaining, edifying, and educational for you all. I'd like to say a big thank you to everybody who's been involved in this episode, especially on this occasion, V. McCrinnan. Say goodbye to the boys and girls.
Goodbye, boys and girls.
Who's been listening in on my iPad all the way through and adding his bits of wisdom and suggestions and sniggering as and when it was appropriate. For those of you who don't know, V and I have been friends for an awful long time, and it's really good to have him in the show so often. And for those of you who watch the show on Saturday afternoons at 3 when we do the live premiere, me, V and Louis, our producer, are 99% of the time there in the live chat to talk to you, which is something I'm very pleased with. Now, before we go, I would also like to remind you that we are nearly out of time for submissions for the 2022/2023 CFZ yearbook, so please send them in to the editorial address. And I want to say thank you to Richard and to Carl and to V and to Louis and to Graham and to Miss Maxine and to everybody else who's been part of this show over the last few weeks. It's lovely to have you here. I'm very proud of you. I'm very happy to do this, because this is probably the high spot of my fairly dull and humdrum little life. We'll be back in 7 days' time on Saturday afternoon at 3. So, on behalf of Lily and me, next Saturday afternoon I'm going to be here, ready for you, and if you are going to be here, ready for me, and V is going to be waiting to see if he can catch me saying what I say. Until then, Kuni alaikum.